In the year 2025, the world expected Africa to remain what it had always been to global powers, a vast warehouse of raw materials, cheap, unprocessed, endlessly extracted. But something extraordinary happened. For the first time in modern history, African nations began shutting the gates, not out of weakness, but with a newfound strength. They declared to the world, "Our resources will no longer serve others while our people remain poor." At the heart of this awakening stood leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, men unafraid to defy tradition, unafraid to confront the powerful, and unafraid to pay the price for sovereignty. From cobalt in Congo to lithium in Zimbabwe, from gold in Burkina Faso to cocoa in Ghana, Africa's most precious treasures were no longer leaving the continent unchallenged. This was not a protest. It was a revolution, an economic uprising that would shake the very foundations of the West. A continent long dismissed as dependent was now rewriting the rules of global trade. If you believe this is the dawn of Africa's true independence, stay with us. Subscribe now and join us as we uncover the hidden story behind this historic turning point in Africa news. In early 2025, a series of extraordinary declarations swept across Africa. From Kinshasa to Ouagadougou, governments began to pass laws that stunned the world. The Democratic Republic of Congo announced that its cobalt, an element essential for electric cars and smartphones, would no longer be exported in raw form. Zimbabwe followed, placing restrictions on lithium, a mineral that powers the global transition to green energy. Burkina Faso, under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, did the same with gold and other critical resources. These were not random decisions. For decades, the wealth of Africa had been drained in silence. Vast deposits of cobalt, lithium, gold, cocoa, and oil left the continent in ships and cargo planes, while African nations remained some of the poorest on Earth. Western corporations grew rich, African workers stayed poor. The contradiction became unbearable. By early March, the continent's most resource-rich nations had drawn a line in the sand, no more. They declared that their raw materials would be processed inside Africa, creating jobs and industries at home, rather than fueling factories overseas. The announcement shocked Western capitals. In Washington, Paris, and London, policymakers scrambled to understand what was happening. News outlets ran urgent headlines. African nations turn off the resource tap. Business leaders warned of rising costs, disrupted supply chains, and even a threat to the West's technological edge. But inside Africa, the mood was very different. In the streets of Ouagadougou, young men and women waved flags and chanted Traoré's name. Farmers in Ghana saw hope that cocoa would finally mean prosperity. Engineers in Congo spoke of new factories that might rise where only mines once stood. It was not just a policy change. It was the beginning of an African declaration of independence, not from colonial borders this time, but from economic chains. For the first time in living memory, the flow of wealth was set to reverse. Yet this was only the opening act of a much larger story, one that would ignite fierce reactions across the globe. And as the dust began to settle, a question emerged. How would the world's most powerful nations respond to Africa's defiance? The moment Africa closed its doors to the unchecked export of raw materials, a storm erupted across the globe. Western governments, so accustomed to controlling the flow of African wealth, were suddenly on the defensive. For decades, multinational corporations had relied on cobalt from Congo, lithium from Zimbabwe, and gold from Burkina Faso to feed their industries. Overnight, their supply chains were fractured, their profit margins threatened, and their confidence shaken. In Paris, French officials gathered in emergency sessions, worried about what they described as a coordinated economic rebellion. For France, which had long treated West Africa as its economic backyard, the words of Ibrahim Traoré carried a stinging reminder. We will no longer accept poverty as the price of our cooperation. The defiance from Ouagadougou was no longer just rhetoric, it was law. In Washington, analysts briefed lawmakers on the gravity of the moment. If Africa refuses to export unprocessed minerals, our industries will face severe shortages within months, one report warned. The automotive sector, heavily reliant on batteries made from African cobalt and lithium, braced for price shocks. Tech companies, giants like Apple and Tesla, watched nervously as their future products became entangled in African sovereignty. Meanwhile, the streets of Africa told a very different story. In Ouagadougou, young citizens carried banners with Traoré's portrait, calling him the defender of dignity. In Kinshasa, workers who had once dug cobalt in misery now spoke of new possibilities: refineries, factories, and local industries that would give value to their labor. What had begun as a policy shift quickly transformed into a continental movement. But the celebration was not without danger. Rumors circulated that Western powers were considering covert strategies to destabilize the governments leading this revolt. Commentators speculated about economic sanctions, trade blockades, or even the return of shadowy military interventions. History had shown that whenever Africa tried to break free, the chains of outside interference tightened. Yet this time felt different. Ibrahim Traoré's firm stance became a rallying cry. "Africa is not poor," he declared. "Africa has been made poor." His words spread across the continent like fire, fueling the determination of millions to defend what was rightfully theirs. And soon, the world would see just how far Africa's leaders were willing to go to protect this new vision. As the declaration spread across the continent, Africa's message thundered across the airwaves: no more exploitation. Western media outlets quickly framed the development as a crisis. Headlines warned of a new resource war, with Africa at the center. Television panels in Europe debated whether nations like Burkina Faso were risking economic suicide or launching a global shockwave. But the most revealing responses came from the markets themselves. Within weeks, the price of cobalt doubled, lithium surged, and gold climbed to its highest value in years. Investors panicked, but in Africa, celebrations erupted. For once, the continent's decisions, not Western boardrooms, were driving global prices. In Ghana, cocoa farmers cheered the government's pledge to keep raw beans at home for local chocolate production. In Zimbabwe, miners wore shirts emblazoned with the phrase, "Lithium belongs to the people." And in Burkina Faso, where President Ibrahim Traoré had emerged as a symbol of defiance, streets filled with music and drumming as citizens declared their readiness to endure hardships if it meant freedom from dependency. The international reaction, however, grew sharper. The European Union issued a statement urging dialogue and cooperation, but behind closed doors, officials demanded strategies to secure alternative sources. The United States, balancing its rhetoric of democracy with its economic interests, called for mutual benefit while quietly assessing the strategic risks of Africa's new policies. China, on the other hand, seized the moment. Beijing dispatched envoys to negotiate joint ventures in processing plants across Africa, promising billions in investment. To Western eyes, this was alarming. Not only was Africa cutting off unprocessed exports, it was also finding new partners eager to help process and refine resources on African soil. Tensions rose further when France, facing growing energy and resource shortages, hinted at the need for a firm response. African commentators recalled decades of foreign interventions and warned that sanctions, or worse, might soon follow. Yet, amid the rising storm, a clear truth emerged. This was no longer just an economic decision. It was a battle over sovereignty, pride, and the future of an entire continent. And with each passing day, the stand led by Ibrahim Traoré and his peers grew less like a gamble, and more like the beginning of Africa's long-awaited rebirth. The tremors of Africa's export revolution did not stop at stock exchanges in New York or Frankfurt. They reached deep into the daily lives of ordinary Africans, reshaping expectations and sparking debates from dusty villages to bustling capitals. In Ghana's countryside, farmers who had long lived at the mercy of international buyers suddenly felt a shift in dignity. For decades, cocoa beans left their farms at bargain prices, while imported European chocolate bars returned at 10 or 20 times the value. Now, with Accra investing in grinding plants and pledging to sell chocolate made in Africa to the world, farmers began to imagine futures for their children that stretched beyond subsistence. The sense of hope was fragile, but it was real. In Burkina Faso, the nationalization of gold mines under Ibrahim Traoré stirred even stronger emotions. To many, it was an act of historic justice. For years, foreign companies had carted off truckloads of gold, while villages near the mines remained without clean water or electricity. When the government declared the mines property of the people, celebrations broke out across Ouagadougou. Mothers ululated in the streets, elders raised their hands to the sky, and young men waved flags declaring sovereignty or nothing. For them, this was not merely an economic policy. It was a restoration of dignity stolen for generations. Still, the civil consequences were not all triumphant. Urban markets in Lagos, Harare, and Abidjan reported temporary price spikes as exports slowed and governments scrambled to adapt. Imported goods became more expensive, and critics accused leaders of gambling with people's livelihoods. "What good is sovereignty if bread costs double?" shouted one merchant in Abidjan. The question reflected a reality African leaders could not ignore. True independence demanded patience from citizens who were already weary of hardship. Yet, something deeper was unfolding. Across Africa, civic groups, youth movements, and trade unions began organizing not just to protest, but to participate. Workshops in Nairobi and Dakar trained young entrepreneurs in processing industries. Activists in Bamako demanded that nationalizations be paired with transparency to prevent corruption. The export bans and reforms became more than policy. They became a spark of civic awakening as citizens realized that sovereignty was not only about leaders, but about collective responsibility. And in the beating heart of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore's message resonated most. Sacrifice today, so that tomorrow Africa may rise. While civil society absorbed the shockwaves of Africa's bold economic turn, the political sphere entered a new and dangerous chapter. For decades, African leaders had been measured by their compliance with Western norms. Now, those who dared to defy were judged by an entirely different standard: their ability to withstand external pressure while rallying domestic support. The political consequences were immediate. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore emerged as the face of a rising Pan-African defiance. His fiery speeches linked gold nationalization to the unfinished struggles of decolonization, striking chords that echoed far beyond his borders. Crowds in Bamako, Niamey, and even Johannesburg carried banners with his portrait, chanting for sovereignty. For the first time in generations, African politics seemed to coalesce around a shared narrative: Africa for Africans. But this surge of pride came with risks. Western governments convened emergency discussions, with France pressing for sanctions, and the United States considering trade reviews. Diplomatic cables leaked to the press revealed deep anxieties. If Africa succeeded in forcing industries to relocate to its soil, it would upend the global economic hierarchy. Some Western strategists openly asked whether Africa was slipping out of control. African leaders understood these dangers. They remembered past coups, assassinations, and regime changes engineered when resource policies threatened Western interests. To shield themselves, many began weaving new diplomatic strategies. Namibia invited Chinese and Indian investors into joint ventures. Ghana courted Turkish and Russian technology for processing facilities. Nigeria sought regional pacts to present a united front in negotiations with the EU. The logic was clear. A multipolar world offered protection that a unipolar West never would. Inside the African Union, whispers turned into action. Ministers floated the idea of a continental framework on resource sovereignty, a loose coordination that would prevent any single nation from being isolated and punished. Though fragile and unfinished, it signaled a growing awareness. Africa's strength lay not in fragmented policies, but in collective resolve. For political elites, the stakes could not be higher. Success meant legitimacy, power, and the chance to reshape the destiny of their nations. Failure could mean unrest, collapse, or even foreign intervention. Yet leaders like Traore pressed forward, convinced that history demanded courage. And so, by the end of 2025, Africa's political stage had transformed. No longer a theater of dependency, it had become a battlefield of sovereignty, where every policy, every alliance, and every speech carried the weight of a continent's rebirth. To understand why Africa's 2025 export bans shook the world, one must return to the shadows of history. For centuries, Africa was not treated as a continent of nations, but as a warehouse of wealth for others. The colonial era institutionalized a system in which minerals, metals, and crops flowed outward, while poverty and dependency remained behind. In the 19th century, European powers carved Africa into colonies at the Berlin Conference, ignoring cultures and borders in pursuit of rubber, ivory, gold, and slaves. Railroads were laid not to connect African towns, but to connect mines with ports. Cocoa farms in Ghana, copper pits in Zambia, and diamond fields in South Africa were all wired into the veins of Europe's industrial machine. When independence came in the mid-20th century, it promised liberation. Yet the structures of exploitation persisted. Newly independent states found themselves bound by contracts and trade agreements designed to keep raw resources cheap and flowing outward. Economists labeled it neo-colonialism, a polite phrase for an old reality. Cocoa farmers in Côte d'Ivoire earned pennies while multinational chocolate companies reaped billions. Gold dug from Burkina Faso's soil enriched Swiss banks, while the villages near the mines remained without clinics. Cobalt from Congo fueled the rise of smartphones and electric cars, yet Congolese children still labored in pits with bare hands. Generations of Africans grew up with the bitter knowledge that the world's luxuries were built on their labor and land. Politicians spoke of sovereignty, but when they attempted reforms, they faced coups, embargoes, or crushing debt. It is against this backdrop of centuries-long extraction that the 2025 export bans must be seen. They were not sudden. They were the delayed echo of a continent finally deciding to break a cycle as old as colonial conquest itself. The decades after independence were filled with leaders who dreamed of reshaping this destiny. Figures like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, and Patrice Lumumba of the Congo called for self-reliance and control of resources. They warned that true freedom meant more than raising a new flag. It required economic sovereignty. Yet those who pushed hardest often paid the highest price. Lumumba was assassinated within a year of independence. Sankara, who spoke of using Burkina Faso's land and gold to free his people from aid dependency, was cut down in a coup. Their visions flickered but did not die. They became seeds planted deep in the memory of Africa's youth. Through the 1980s and 1990s, many nations turned to international lenders to survive debt crises. Structural adjustment programs from the IMF and World Bank imposed privatizations and austerity. Foreign corporations tightened their hold on mines, oil fields, and plantations. The dream of self-reliance felt further away. Still, frustration built like pressure beneath the surface. By the 21st century, Africa's youth bulge and rising education levels created a new political force. Leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso drew directly on Sankara's legacy, reminding citizens that sovereignty must be seized, not requested. The resource nationalism of 2025, whether Congo's cobalt suspension, Zimbabwe's lithium ban, or Burkina Faso's mine nationalizations, was more than economic maneuvering. It was the fulfillment of long-delayed promises. For Western economies, this was a shock. For Africans, it was recognition that history had caught up. The year 2025 did not simply mark new policies. It marked a turning point in a struggle that stretched back centuries. A moment when the weight of history tipped and the old order began to crack. What startled Western capitals most in 2025 was not just the bans themselves, but how Africa wielded them with precision. For years, the assumption in Washington, Brussels, and Paris was that Africa's governments were too fragmented, too unstable, and too dependent on aid to act in unison. Yet within weeks of Congo's cobalt freeze and Burkina Faso's gold nationalizations, it became clear that something different was happening. Instead of collapsing under pressure, African governments began coordinating informally, sharing legal language, trade strategies, and investment models. Zimbabwe's mining ministry openly praised Namibia's restrictions on rare earths. Burkina Faso's leaders cited Ghana's cocoa pricing reforms as justification for their own sovereignty moves. It was not a formal alliance, but it had the effect of one. Each decision reinforced the next, creating a continental echo. The real twist was that Western industries discovered they had far fewer alternatives than they believed. Cobalt, lithium, gold, cocoa. These were not commodities one could easily source elsewhere. Stockpiles ran thin. Latin American and Asian suppliers lacked the sheer reserves Africa controlled. Even China, often seen as the fallback, was itself dependent on African imports to feed its vast processing industry. Suddenly, boardrooms in New York and Frankfurt realized they were no longer negotiating with weak individual states, but with a continent learning to exercise collective leverage. What began as a patchwork of national policies was evolving into a geopolitical force, and at the center of this shift were leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who framed these moves not as protectionism, but as a moral and political awakening. Africa was no longer begging for investment. It was dictating terms. For the West, that was the twist no one had prepared for. By late 2025, it was no longer just about minerals or contracts. It was about symbolism. For generations, African leaders had been portrayed as dependent, pleading for aid or negotiating from weakness. But now, figures like Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stood before their people and declared that gold, land, and labor would no longer be plundered without consequence. This new stance carried power far beyond economics. In Ouagadougou, the image of Traoré nationalizing 5 gold mines became a rallying cry, a modern echo of Thomas Sankara's unfinished revolution. In Harare, Zimbabwe's insistence that lithium remain within its borders was cast not only as industrial policy, but as a demand for dignity. In Accra and Abidjan, cocoa growers saw the 400 per ton premium as proof that African farmers' sweat finally had weight in global negotiations. Western analysts were unsettled not just because supply chains were disrupted, but because Africa's defiance was inspiring. Young Africans, once told to seek their future abroad, began to believe that opportunity might finally be built at home. The twist was clear. What began as an economic maneuver was becoming a continental identity shift. Africa was no longer the silent partner in world trade. It was speaking with one voice, even without a formal union. For the West, this was the unthinkable. A continent long written off as dependent was now reshaping the rules of globalization. For Africa, it was a long overdue recognition that sovereignty meant more than flags and anthems. It meant deciding how the world used its resources. And at the heart of this transformation, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré had become living symbols of a new era, proof that history itself could bend. As 2025 drew to a close, the story of Africa was no longer written in boardrooms thousands of miles away. It was written in the copper hills of Congo, the cocoa fields of Ghana, the gold veins of Burkina Faso, and the lithium mines of Zimbabwe. For the first time in living memory, Africa was not waiting for permission. It was issuing its own terms. The world had expected hesitation, compromise, or retreat. Instead, it witnessed resolve. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré proved that sovereignty was not a dream, but a choice, a hard, costly choice that required courage. And that courage inspired millions. Farmers, miners, and youth alike began to see themselves not as subjects of global markets, but as citizens of nations reclaiming destiny. For the West, this was a disruption. For Africa, it was liberation. The gates once left wide open were now guarded by dignity, strategy, and unity. This is only the beginning. The future battles will be harder, the pressures fiercer, but the tide has turned. Africa has awakened, and the world will never be the same. If you believe this moment matters, subscribe and stand with us as we continue to follow the unfolding chapters of Africa News.